So we've talked about various examples of domestic inequalities in the United States. Now let's talk a little bit about how the United States contributed to inequalities abroad, outside of the country. Okay, so from the 1870s going into the early 1900s, this is a period that some call the period of new imperialism. Okay, when I say imperialism, I'm talking about empire. All right, imperialism, empire. Right, and so we're talking about a period where a number of European countries or European empires, as well as Japan, sought to expand and gain territory and colonize other parts of the globe. Particularly, they were focused heavily on Africa. So you have countries like Britain, France, Germany, which were focused on colonizing parts of Africa, and they did, Belgium as well. And so you have the expansion there. You also have various European powers gaining spheres of influence in China, right? There's a whole issue there where China's government was weakened and various European powers came in and dominated certain regions of the country, okay? And so you have an expansion there also in the Middle East as well. So this is the period of new imperialism. And the United States was not really getting involved in expanding territory. Right? Instead, the US was more focused on expanding trade, right? Economic domination. And the US claimed the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence when it came to economic and political influence. Okay? And so the US is focused on expanding its trade, wants to expand trade even more so into Asia. But the U.S. did expand into other territories as well during this period. One example, before we talk about the Spanish-American War, one example we'll take a look at is the takeover of Hawaii. The Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown by a group of American businessmen in 1893. Okay, Queen Liliuokalani was overthrown by these American businessmen who had been conspiring against her. There had been a number of issues already leading up to restrictions on the freedom of Hawaiians as these American businessmen had found their way into the cabinet of the former king of Hawaii, and they had been forcing a very restrictive constitution on the Kingdom of Hawaii. It was a constitutional monarchy which restricted the voting rights of Native Hawaiians. And eventually, when Queen Liliuokalani wanted to overturn that constitution, you have these American businessmen overthrowing her government and taking control of the country and creating their own government there, okay, their own independent government. Eventually, several years later in 1898, the United States would formally annex Hawaii and Hawaii would become a territory in the United States. This was done under the administration of President William McKinley. And eventually Hawaii would become the 50th state in the United States, and that's in 1959. In addition to the takeover of Hawaii, the United States would also expand its territory through the Spanish-American War, all right? So in Cuba, there was already a war for independence going on in the late 1800s, okay? Cubans had been trying to gain independence from the Spanish Empire for years, right? Throughout the 1800s, there were several different wars that took place, and this was the final war for independence in the late 1800s, all right? So American businessmen had businesses set up on the island of Cuba. So when the Cuban War for Independence threatens American businesses on Cuba, the U.S. sends in the Navy, okay? A naval ship, the USS Maine. And in 1889, while the USS Maine was docked there in Havana, it explodes all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, it explodes, right? And the press, the tabloid press, also known as the Yellow Press, this is basically like tabloid papers that we have today, or tabloid magazines. They completely sensationalized what happened, and they claimed that it was Spain. Spain blew up the USS Maine, killed 270 people. What's the United States gonna do, right? So the US basically reaches out to Spain and says, look, you need to stop this war for independence. You need to just accept that Cuba is going to be independent, it's gonna have its own independent government. Just let go of Cuba, right? Let Cuba become independent, recognize the independence of Cuba. And so the US is demanding that Spain bring an end to the war and recognize Cuban independence. But Spain refuses. They say, no, we're not going to let go of our colony. There's a lot of money there. There's a bunch of sugar plantations on Cuba. And so that's bringing in some wealth for the Spanish Empire. So because Spain refuses to recognize Cuban independence, the United States is going to declare war on Spain. Okay. Again, this is President McKinley, right? He asked Congress to declare war, and they do. And on top of that, Congress is going to pass an amendment known as the Teller Amendment. And basically what it's saying is, look, our intentions in the Spanish-American War are not to conquer Cuba, and we're not going to annex Cuba, and we're not even going to dominate Cuba. We are just basically going there to free Cuba, right? So that it could gain its independence. And so now the US enters into the Spanish-American War, and the war is very brief, only lasts about 4 months, and ultimately Spain is defeated. And when Spain is defeated, the US gains some of Spain's colonies, right? The US is going to expand. It's going to gain Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, all right? Because these were all Spanish colonies, right? So now, seems like the US is also becoming an empire, even though it's not supposed to be an empire, it's supposed to be a democracy, but it's expanding and taking over these territories. And they're not official territories, they're not states, so what's going on? Is this an empire? What's happening here? Okay, and also on top of that, in Cuba, the Cuban government, the newly independent Cuban government, is forced to include an amendment in the Cuban Constitution, and that's the Platt Amendment. Okay, and what does the Platt Amendment say? Basically, the Platt Amendment is saying that the United States has the right to intervene militarily in Cuban affairs if it feels that it's necessary. Okay, so again, if American businesses are threatened in Cuba, the US can send in the military to make sure that the US businesses are protected and are safe.